To understand the stories that haunt us, we have to start with the man who wrote them. The life of Edgar Allan Poe was, in many ways, a precursor to the dark, turbulent themes he would eventually master in his fiction. Born in Boston in 1809, Poe's journey began with a profound sense of loss. He was the second child of two actors, David and Eliza Poe. But his father abandoned the family when he was only a year old, and his mother died of tuberculosis shortly after. This early abandonment cast a long shadow over his entire existence, leaving him an orphan at a tender age. He was eventually taken in by John and Frances Allan of Richmond, Virginia. John Allan was a successful merchant, a man who dealt in everything from cloth and tobacco to tombstones, and he provided Poe with an education in England and later at the University of Virginia. But the relationship between the two was never easy. Poe's life was defined by constant friction with his foster father, a tension that would follow him well into his adulthood. The Allans never formally adopted him, and while they provided for him, the bond was fraught with conflict, alternating between periods of spoiling and aggressive discipline. These struggles weren't just emotional, they were practical and devastating. After facing mounting debts and frequent quarrels with John Allan over the funds needed for his studies, Poe found himself forced to leave the university. His path then took a sharp turn toward West Point, where he enlisted under the assumed name of Edgar A. Perry. However, his time in the military was short-lived, ending in a dismissal that mirrored his earlier failures in the eyes of his foster father. He spent much of his life caught in a relentless cycle of poverty and brilliance, a man who desperately wanted to carve out a professional identity, but was constantly undermined by his own volatility and the lack of a stable support system. Even as he achieved literary prominence, winning a major prize in 1833 for his story Ms. Found in a Bottle, and establishing himself as a pioneer of detective fiction, horror, and literary criticism, the crushing reality of financial instability never truly left him. Poe was one of the first American writers to attempt to earn a living exclusively through his writing, but he was fighting an uphill battle. At the time, there were no international copyright laws, meaning American publishers often preferred to print unauthorized, cheap copies of British authors rather than pay American writers for original work. Combined with the economic devastation of the Panic of 1837, Poe found himself in a constant state of tension, a man caught between immense creative genius and the desperate daily struggle for subsistence. It was this very struggle, this sense of being an outsider, constantly battling against a world that didn't quite understand him, that fueled the darkness in his work. This connection between the artist and the void is perhaps most vividly captured in one of his most chilling stories, The Oval Portrait. The story moves us away from Poe's own life and into a dark meditation on the true cost of creation. We meet a painter who is deeply, perhaps dangerously, in love with his wife. He is a man driven by a singular, obsessive pursuit. He wants to capture her likeness on canvas with a level of realism that transcends mere representation. He doesn't just want to paint her, he wants to trap her essence within the frame. To achieve this perfection, the painter retreats into a dark, lonely studio, shutting himself away from the rest of the world. As his obsession grows, he becomes increasingly absorbed in the play of light and shadow on the canvas. He becomes so lost in his work that he grows oblivious to the world around him, and more importantly, he becomes oblivious to his wife's declining health. He stops seeing her as a living, breathing woman with her own needs and fears. Instead, he begins to view her merely as a subject to be perfected. There is a parasitic quality to his devotion. As he works, a strange, supernatural exchange seems to take place. The more vibrant and lifelike the colours on the canvas become, the more the woman herself grows pale and spiritless. The portrait is gaining a soul, but it is taking that soul from the woman standing before it. She becomes a passive victim of his artistic madness, a muse who is being slowly consumed by the very act of being painted. The story reaches its climax in a moment of terrifying triumph. The painter applies the final brushstroke, and in that instant he realizes he has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He has captured life itself within the portrait. The image is so vivid, so startlingly real, that it seems to possess a haunting, supernatural vitality. But as he turns away from the canvas to share his triumph with his wife, the reality of what he has done hits him with devastating force. The effort of being his muse has cost her everything. As he turns, he finds that the woman he loves is gone, She has died, leaving him alone with a portrait that looks more alive than she ever did. To really understand Poe, you have to look at the way his life and his fiction bleed into one another. He wasn't just a man writing ghost stories, he was a man living in a state of constant, grinding instability. When we read about the themes of decay, loss, and the struggle for survival in his stories, we're seeing the echoes of a real person who was perpetually fighting to keep his head above water. His career was a series of professional shifts between Baltimore, Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York, often marked by sudden terminations, like his brief and volatile stint as an editor at the Southern Literary Messenger, where he was allegedly fired for being drunk on the job. This kind of existence, living on the edge of poverty while trying to maintain a sense of intellectual dignity, creates a specific kind of tension. It's a tension that shows up in his prose as a sense of looming dread, as if the world itself is something that might slip away from you at any moment. This sense of something slipping away is perhaps most hauntingly captured in the oval portrait. On the surface, it's a story about a man who gets too caught up in his work, but if you look closer, it's a profound meditation on the parasitic nature of art. There's this idea in the story that the act of creation isn't just a way of capturing life, but a way of consuming it. The painter becomes so focused on the light and shadow on the canvas that he loses sight of the actual, breathing woman standing right in front of him. He isn't painting his wife anymore, he's painting an idea of her. And as that idea becomes more vivid and more real on the canvas, the woman herself becomes less real. She fades. She pales. It's as if the portrait is a sponge, soaking up the vitality of the subject to fuel its own artificial life. This creates a terrifying zero-sum game. In Poe's world, beauty and life are often at odds. You can have the living, breathing, messy reality of a person, or you can have the perfect, eternal, frozen image of them, but you can't have both. The moment the painter achieves his masterpiece, the moment the portrait truly lives, the woman is gone. It's a chilling conclusion because it suggests that perfection is a kind of death. To make something immortal through art, you have to strip away the very things that make it alive. This brings us to the duality of the creative mind, a theme that runs through so much of Poe's work. There is a recurring sense that the human psyche is like a haunted palace, a place capable of housing both sublime divine beauty and a deep demonic darkness. The painter in the story is a perfect example of this. He is driven by love, by a desire to honor his wife through his craft, but that love is twisted into an obsession that becomes destructive. He isn't a villain in the traditional sense, he's just a man who has lost the boundary between the representation and the reality. He's so focused on the truth of the image that he fails to see the truth of the person. We see this same blurring of lines in how we view Poe himself. For a long time, biographers tried to reduce him to a series of tropes: the tragic, drunken, mad genius. They often focused on his struggles with debt or his turbulent relationship with his foster father, John Allan, to paint a picture of a man who was simply out of control. But that's a very flat way of looking at him. It misses the sheer disciplined willpower it took to produce such a massive and influential body of work while living in such precarious circumstances. His life wasn't just a series of misfortunes, it was a constant, exhausting struggle to bridge the gap between his immense internal world and the harsh, external reality of his finances and his social standing. Even his greatest success, the publication of The Raven in 1845, which brought him instant fame, couldn't fully shield him from the instability that defined his life. He died in 1849 under mysterious circumstances in Baltimore, leaving behind a legacy that was as fragmented and enigmatic as his own biography. When we look at the oval portrait through that lens, the story takes on a much heavier weight. It's not just a Gothic tale about a spooky painting, it's a reflection on the cost of looking too closely. It's about the danger of becoming so absorbed in our own visions, our own work, or our own grief, that we stop interacting with the world as it actually is. Poe seems to be warning us that the pursuit of perfection, whether in art, in love, or in understanding, can often lead to a kind of spiritual exhaustion. We try to capture the essence of things, but in doing so, we might just end up destroying the very things we were trying to preserve. It's a haunting thought, that the more we try to freeze a moment in time, the more we lose the pulse of the present.